During the 1800s, we also saw the rise of a new religious movement referred to as the Second Great Awakening. And along with this religious movement, one of the most influential ministers of this time was Charles Grandison Finney, right? It was through his teachings that became very popular throughout the US, that new types of belief systems and new ways of thinking emerged based on this Second Great Awakening. Part of Finney's sermons, of the speeches that he would give people, challenged very traditional Protestant views. He stressed that there was an emotional attachment to religion, that you should feel passionate about your religious beliefs. And he emphasized more the power of each man or each person rather than the power of the church. That it wasn't up to the church to control what would happen to one's own soul and salvation, but rather it was within the own individual of being able to establish that. And so he really stressed personal responsibility. And one of the most influential ideas of the Second Great Awakening that's really going to influence the rest of the country and a whole movement is this idea of wanting to improve the world. Because it's through these ideas of the Second Great Awakening that we're going to see the emergence of what's known as the reform movement, of trying to improve different aspects of society. And it happens now in the mid 1800s, and it's really greatly rooted in these ideas of the Great Awakening. So some of the movements that emerged from the Great Awakening to try and get reform in society, one of them was the temperance movement, which we'll see that will continue to grow throughout the 1800s. And the temperance movement is based on the fact of wanting to ban alcoholism or alcohol itself. This was in large supporters of people who felt that alcohol, and especially alcohol abuse, was the root of a lot of society's problems, and they wanted to establish a ban on alcohol. And we'll see that a lot of women begin to support this temperance movement, mostly because they see what comes along with alcohol abuse and the different issues that emerge from that. And so they felt that if they could ban alcohol itself, then it would resolve a lot of these issues that came along with drinking. And the temperance movement over time has become very, very influential, because we'll see that in the early 1900s, it's actually going to work. And that's when we have the whole prohibition era, where alcohol really is illegal in the United States. Eventually, that amendment is going to be revoked. But we see how the influence of the temperance movement does make a difference throughout the United States, and just how influential it becomes. There was also a movement in the 1800s for prison reform. One of the major leaders of this movement was Dorothea Dix, and she was responsible for creating or encouraging the creation of mental institutions, because before, you had criminals and those that had some kind of mental illness or mental disease. They were all placed in the same place. They were all in jail, right? So even these people who were sick and had diseases, and they weren't necessarily criminals in that sense, but they needed help and treatment, there was no mental institution for these people. So through Dorothea Dixon, her advocating in her works, they actually began to establish mental institutions and make a difference between criminals and those committing crimes by choice into going into jail, and those that were then evaluated and deemed that they had some kind of mental illness or mental disease to have their own special facilities. We also see the beginning of the juvenile justice system as well. We begin to see how also those that were children and kids who also get themselves into trouble, they have their own judicial system that they go through, and they're not also placed in jails with adults as well. There was also a large number of different things that happened through education reform, and Horace Mann really was the most influential person in establishing education reform. He believed in what was referred to as the common school movement, where all children, no matter who you were, whether you were rich or you were poor, all children were taught in a common place. And from this education reform, we also began to see different types of schools emerging, right? We had normal schools that started, which were the first schools that were particularly just for teacher training. We also had all-girls school that began to emerge by Catherine Beecher, created the first all-girls school. Samuel Gridley Howe created the first school for the blind. That's actually the school that Helen Keller eventually attended. Thomas Gallaudet, he created a school for the deaf. Oberlin College was actually the first college to admit women and African Americans. So there was new reform movements happening in education as well. We're also going to talk a little bit more about other types of reform movements, more in depth, in particular, the abolitionist movement against slavery, and also the women's right movement. All comes from this idea of reform, and all of these things are rooted in these first belief systems of this Second Great Awakening. So we see how influential the Second Great Awakening was in actually setting along this whole reform movement here in the United States.